Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we're chatting with Dr. Elliot Van Dusen. Dr. Van Dusen is a retired rural Canadian mounted police officer, parapsychologist, and author of 3 books, including Evil in Exeter, Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement, and his newest book, More Supernatural Encounters from Law Enforcement. His parapsychological work has been featured on the Discovery Channel, the Daily News, the Chronicle Herald, and on several podcasts and radio programs. He is also the founder and director of Paranormal Phenomena and Investigations of Canada. You can find his books on Amazon, Kindle, or at ppri.net. Hey, Elliot, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, like I said, you retired from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so how does a police officer get into writing paranormal books and becoming a parapsychologist?
Well, I was interested in the paranormal before I joined the RCMP. I always credit the television show Unsolved Mysteries as being responsible for getting me into the paranormal, because I always knew I wanted to be a police officer. And I also, had an interest in ghosts and UFOs. So when I found Unsolved Mysteries, the show was great because it always had cold case homicides, and then of course it would have ghosts and UFO cases. So then in 1997, when I discovered X-Files, which came out in 93, but I hadn't seen it until 1997, I thought it was really cool that they had 2 law enforcement officers investigating the paranormal. And so I started paranormal phenomena research and investigation to investigate claims of the paranormal. And then later that year, my mom had seen an article in the newspaper of a parapsychologist teaching courses at the Nova Scotia Community College. So I enrolled in those, and all those years later now, Daryl and I are still really good friends and colleagues, but Daryl Walsh was teaching them. And I took his 2 courses and passed them, and then he invited me to join his research group, which was called the Center for Parapsychological Studies in Canada. And that's where I gained some field investigation experience. And then I kind of continued on taking my parapsychological education wherever I could find it. I did a diploma at Stratford Career Institute, and then over the years, I've taken multiple courses from Ryan Education Center. I took a witchcraft course from University of Ottawa. I took a Ancient Monsters course from University of Glasgow. I took the parapsychology course from University of Edinburgh. And most recently, I took Dr. Karen O'Keefe's Exorcism and Possession course from the School of Parapsychology. He's a parapsychologist over in the UK. So I'm always upgrading and trying to stay up to date on the latest research. When I joined the RCMP, though, I kind of kept that quiet. I learned very quickly that the organization didn't really seem to appreciate the paranormal, I guess. Much like Fox Mulder, I received a lot of ridicule for my involvement in the paranormal, so I kind of kept it quiet up until towards the end of my career, about 2 years left of my career, I guess. That's when I became involved in a field investigation down in Exeter, Rhode Island, which I wrote my first book on, called Evil in Exeter. And then when I retired, I came back out into the public, doing podcasts and interviews and, right out in the public eye kind of thing. So it's funny, I always get asked that question, like, was there a paranormal event that happened that got me into it? But I didn't actually experience anything until I started investigating the paranormal. So that's how I got involved.
Yeah, I just like everybody's origin stories, because most people I talk to have a unique, different way that they got into the paranormal. And actually, it's funny that you say the X-Files kind of helped you get into the paranormal and wanting to get into the field to be a parapsychologist, because I just talked to a guest a few weeks ago named Gary Allen, and he became a paranormal author because of the X-Files, because he liked the way that it was structured and that type of stuff, and it kind of helped get him more into the paranormal. But I just find it interesting, especially with like police officers and stuff, because I was an EMT for many, many years, and so being in that world, I kind of understand coming from that world. But police officers tend to be tight-lipped about things, yeah, because like you were saying, you got ridiculed for it, And also, I mean, you don't want your credibility to be called out if you have to go to court or something by a defense attorney.
Well, I think that's why the organization or the management of the organization probably give people such a hard time, because they're probably worried about, like you said, something like that coming up in court. It's kind of interesting, actually. Like when I wrote my second book, Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement, I had a lot of people in the field of parapsychology asking me how I managed to get people in law enforcement to open up about their experiences, and I really don't even have an answer for it. I don't know if it's because they knew I was a police officer and a paranormal investigator, and they felt comfortable talking to me about it. But basically, after I wrote my first book, my mother had encouraged me to write another one. She really enjoyed the first one, and I said, well, these types of cases don't come along every day. Like maybe I can go through our archives and see if there's any other cases that I worked on that would be, worth writing about. But then I kind of had this idea about my two passions, which is law enforcement and parapsychology. So I started to kind of reach out. I started with some sheriff friends of mine, and to see if they had any experiences. And at some of the courthouses in Halifax, they did have some experiences. Before I knew it, I had collected, a few stories, and then there was a few people that pointed me in the right direction to talk to a few other people, and they were open to talking to me. And next thing I knew, I had about 50 stories collected, and that's what the first law enforcement book was about. And then once that one came out, it was actually really well received by the law enforcement community. I ended up getting messages and text messages and emails from people in law enforcement with more stories. And before I knew it, I had I think there's 41 stories in the newest book that just came out there a couple of weeks ago. So it's been great. Over the last 2 years, I've collected close to 100 different stories, all from law enforcement.
Wow.
All nonfiction. It ranges from UFO sightings to ghost sightings to even cryptid sightings. And it's a lot of stories that people hadn't heard before, or the law enforcement hadn't told anyone else either, besides maybe like close family members. So it's really cool, because there's obviously a lot of paranormal stories that I collected over the last 2 years that we wouldn't even have heard of, had it not been for me pursuing those two books.
Yeah, and you've also dug into the RCMP's files because they used to investigate some of the paranormal stuff.
Yes, I did. Mostly in the 70s and 80s. So they used to have what was called a space contingency program, and it was basically a manual that talked about if there's UFO sighting, the procedure that they have to follow. And it involved investigating UFO sightings. So obviously that would entail, checking your local airport radars, checking the weather, checking for satellite and space debris, and then interviewing witnesses. But then they would also send the files to Department of National Defense, and they would do their investigation as well. And it's kind of funny, because at the end of your shift, you were supposed to have notified D&D, and there's a couple of files that I had gotten through the National Archives in Ottawa, where somebody, and I can relate, being a police officer, was probably tired at the end of their shift and said, you know what, as soon as I get back on shift, I'll fill out the paperwork or notify D&D. It's kind of funny, because there's a couple of notes in some of the files where they got in trouble for not reporting it to D&D before going off shift. So it was taken very, very seriously.
Yeah. With the parapsychology stuff, a lot of people might not know that it's actually a serious science. It's not something that not like one of those correspondence courses where like become a paralegal through the mail. It's actually pretty seriously taken by a good majority of science, and it's actually, you use the scientific method and do research and that type of stuff.
Yes, that is one of the fallacies with parapsychology. Actually, is a lot of people think that it's a pseudoscience. It's actually still listed as a pseudoscience on Wikipedia as well, but I'm part of the Rhine research team that meets every Wednesday, and they've actually asked Wikipedia to change that multiple times, but I guess they have editors and then super editors, and Wikipedia always keeps putting it back to a pseudoscience. But in 1969, it became recognized as a social science, because we study, people's human experiences with the supernatural, and it was recognized by the AAAS, which stands for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. as a social science, and has been since 1969. And even just recently, there was an article with Chris French, who was a well-known skeptic, that actually came out recently and said that he now believes that parapsychology is a science, and it does follow the scientific method. And unfortunately, there's a lot of things that we still don't understand, especially about like human consciousness. We know that it exists, but I mean, other than that, we don't know what happens after it leaves the body, and we have no piece of equipment that can actually detect human consciousness and in the spirit realm. So it's obviously advancing, but I mean, that you could say that about almost any topic, really. I mean, even the current COVID situation. I mean, new information's always coming out about that as well. So it's a tough field because it's not as well funded as other disciplines. So
Right.
A lot of hard work goes into it, and a lot of parapsychologists end up doing other jobs or work for psychology departments and kind of do this from the side of their desk. So, you got to be passionate, I think, to get involved in parapsychology.
Yeah, and I think that it's a fascinating field to get into because, like you said, it's the study of people also, not just the paranormal stuff, but also the people's encounters and their experiences. And I think we need more of the scientific method in the paranormal field. It's okay, there's lots of people that I term ghost hunters nowadays who are going out for the thrill of it, and I think that's great. And I think, the paranormal event that I do and then other people do, I think are great because they bring money and they draw attention to these historical places. But when it comes to actual paranormal investigation, we need that kind of parent, I don't know what word to use, but kind of that, parent science to give us new ideas and new directions to go for the investigation part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's like I said, it's definitely a tough field to get into. You don't get into it to make a, full-blown career out of it. There's only really one parapsychologist that I would say has kind of made a career out of it. That would be Carolyn Watt at the Kessler Parapsychology Unit with the University of Edinburgh, because they actually teach a parapsychology program there. And, she's very lucky that way. Other parapsychologists, like I said, they usually work in psychology departments, sociology departments. You're starting to see a lot of anthropologists as well becoming interested in parapsychology as well. So they've got those other disciplines, and some of them try and, sneak their parapsychology research in under that guise.
Yeah, I think that's great too, coming from different backgrounds, because it gives a different perspective to the research and a different approach.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you really don't know what skill set you have that could be valuable to paranormal investigations. For example, recently we had a new member join our organization from the New England area, because we service PPRI services Atlantic Canada and the New England states, and he's an HVAC technician. And we actually had a video where somebody had a balloon, and it was like a helium balloon, and it was kind of moving strangely, and it kind of like ducked underneath the beam, and it almost looked like a ghost was, carrying it, kind of thing. But he's got that HVAC background, and he was talking about air currents, and even though the heat pump wasn't on in the house, he said, it's still possible because the movement from even 20, 30 minutes ago could still be circulating throughout the house. So you really don't know like what skill sets could be useful. Like obviously science, hard sciences like physics and biology, and social sciences because it's people's experiences, and then there's mental health issues as well. Like a lot of times when you deal with the paranormal, you also deal with mental health issues. So it's good to have that variety of a background for a topic like this.
Yeah, I found my medical background comes in handy, especially dealing with individuals, because of, like you said, mental health and my experience with that. And I investigate with a team called Medics for Paranormal. We're all medics, and so we all have different experiences, but kind of the same skill set. So yeah, that definitely comes in handy. And also our experience dealing with the general public, the difficult part of the general public. I'm sure, you use some of those skills from being a police officer to de-escalate situations or calm people down and stuff like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even, one question I get asked a lot too is, did I take any skill sets from policing and apply them to parapsychology? And my answer is always yes. The one thing that stands out to me is the interviewing, because, you take a lot of interviewing investigative communication courses and interrogation courses. And even I was fortunate enough, I got a child special interview course. So there's a lot of kids that deal with parapsychological issues, and you have to interview them sometimes, or kids as well are more susceptible to reincarnation cases. So to have that background, to be able to properly interview a child without leading them, it's obviously extremely valuable.
Yeah. So you just had the new book come out the end of October, right around Halloween. So let's get into some of those stories. And there's some I like that you included not just because when you say supernatural, paranormal, a lot of people tend to think just ghost. And it's not just ghosts. It's a huge blanket of, UFOs and cryptids, like you were saying, some of the encounters that you had collected. One of the ones, it's one of the very first ones in the new book is from some people that from the RCMP who had an interesting UFO encounter up in kind of the woods up in Canada.
Yeah. Yes, that was a really interesting UFO sighting. So when I was posted to Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, which is on the 63rd parallel, considered the subarctic, there was another community about 350 kilometers north of Yellowknife called Delaney. And one evening they experienced a UFO sighting. There was a member on call because in small communities of 500 people or so, there's roughly 3 police officers. And there's not 24-hour policing, so any time something comes in after hours, somebody that's on call gets a phone call. And Kirk Hughes was the RCMP member, and he received a call, and the dispatcher didn't even know how to articulate it, so she just blurted it out eventually and just said, listen, basically got a call of a UFO sighting here with what the person is describing as like a tractor beam or a laser coming from the bottom of it. And when he looked out his window, at first he thought it was a joke, but when he looked out his window, he actually saw the object and realized very quickly that, it was a legitimate call. So he started his investigation, of course, checking, with the local airport operators, see if there was any scheduled flights coming in, any helicopters, any search and rescue operations. There was nothing. They expanded outside of the local airport, the Yellowknife Airport, and then even to Edmonton International Airport. There was nothing. They ended up watching the object for several hours, and he finally decided to notify his supervisor. And the supervisor had worked as an air traffic controller in a previous career, so it was very interesting to have his perspective as well. Watch it and not, at first he said the same thing, like, is it a plane or a helicopter? And they said, no, they checked all that out. And so they thought that was interesting. And then the third constable had heard of all the commotion going on because in such a small community, obviously, with this present UFO sighting, it's going to attract a lot of attention. So the third constable heard all the commotion out in the street and joined in as well. And he was an amateur photographer, which was really interesting. So they ended up watching the object for, it was close to 2.5 hours. They ended up having to contact the North American command for the military. They actually dispatched 2 fighter jets to go and try and intercept the object. And when the fighter jets got into the vicinity of the UFO disappeared. They were never able to identify what it was. They had done all the research. It wasn't satellites. It wasn't space junk. Wasn't any conventional aircraft. Interestingly enough, I do remember when they flew them in from the community to Yellowknife to debrief them in person, because I thought it was cool, being a paranormal investigator, and this is like something on X-Files here. They're
Right.
calling in the police officers to investigate, like to basically question them, in front of all the top management in Yellowknife. So, I thought it was pretty cool. But the one part I didn't know until I had talked to Kirk about it is that our Canadian Security Intelligence Service was also interested in this and had sent a member of their agency up to investigate. And CSIS would be the equivalent of like your CIA down in the States there. So obviously that sighting was also, taken very seriously, witnessed by an entire community and 3 police officers, and still remains unsolved to this day.
Yeah, I found it really interesting, like you said, the equivalent of the CIA in the States, and then also the fact that the U.S. government took it seriously enough, and NORAD did, to send 2 fighter jets.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, that just gives it more validity there that all of these kind of secret organizations were really interested. So there must have been something to it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's all, and it makes sense that, like with the UFO phenomena right now, there's a lot more disclosure coming out than what there was like back when I started back in 1997. But, I find it interesting because there's been a couple of reports that have been released now saying that these UFOs seem to be interested in our nuclear sites and things like that. So obviously it would make sense to me that the government would be interested in this type of phenomena, especially where they've said repeatedly that they don't know what it is. Barack Obama said on national television that one of the first things he did when he took power was asked about UFOs, and he was told that, that they exist. They just don't know what they are exactly. So, it's really interesting. And, that story, I think, is really cool because it's in the middle of nowhere, literally. And all these government agencies were actually fully on interested in this sighting. So, it was a great UFO sighting as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. And I love the way that you write because all the detail that you put in there and very factual based, instead of a lot of conjecture. Some paranormal authors put a lot of conjecture in there, and I like how you write from a very factual based because of the, your scientific background with the parapsychology.
That and law enforcement too, I think, because the law enforcement makes you, kind of look for the facts, I guess, rather than, fiction.
Right. Some of the other stories that kind of caught my attention were the ones that places you don't expect to be haunted per se. One of them from your first book was the Halifax shopping center.
Yeah.
You don't think of shopping centers being a place of, ghostly activity. You think of like, sanatoriums and places like that.
Yeah. So the Halifax shopping center, I mean, it's relatively, fairly new building. Apparently the land used to be like an old orphanage for boys. And of course, we know through history that those types of places and, mental institutions and things like that weren't exactly the best environment. There was a lot of abuse that took place there, a lot of deaths and things like that. So I did hear that the property had used to be mostly fields. And then, like I said, it had an orphanage for boys on there. And then they built a shopping mall, and they always keep it up to date. It's always being rent out. There's been lots of, stories about the elevator that's haunted in there, and that somebody was working on it one time and had died. Obviously, I haven't seen any like actual police records or anything like that to confirm a death. Just multiple employees that have worked there that said it. So whether or not it's folklore or not is one thing. But the one case that one of my security officer friends had told me that I thought was interesting was it was late at night in the mall, and there was a nurse that had gone to Tower 2 to use the washroom. And when she went into the washroom, every single stall door in the female bathroom was like slamming open and closed on its own, almost like poltergeist type activity. And she was that scared that she went down to the security office to report it to the security officer. And, of course, they went up and checked, and there was nothing there. And then it was kind of interesting as well because he had told me about some tunnels that kind of run into the shopping mall, and they kind of don't really go anywhere. And I talked to my colleague who used to work at the mall when he was younger, and he's a parapsychologist as well. And he had confirmed that. He said that's really strange, just these like tunnels. He thinks they may have been used for storage at some point, stores like storing excessive merchandise. But there's definitely like tunnels in the mall. So it's a really interesting location. Nothing too crazy, happened there that it would scream haunted. But yeah, certainly there's some folklore there and some old history when the orphanage was there. Now, the one interesting thing is that there was almost a Valentine's Day massacre at the mall a couple of years ago. It made international news. Basically, a couple of Canadian kids from Halifax had teamed up with a girl from down in the States, and they were kind of Columbiners, and they had planned this mass murder at the Halifax shopping center, and it got foiled at the last minute because somebody had called Crime Stoppers and tipped the police off. And sure enough, they had arrested the male picking the female up at the airport, And then when they went to go and arrest the second male, I guess, but the third person involved, he ended up committing suicide. So now if that would have happened, you could see that there probably would have been a lot of panic, a lot of chaos at the mall that day. And that may have left a lot of residual energy there. But again, that one was thwarted. So fortunately, so the Halifax shopping center is definitely an interesting location. You don't normally think of malls as being, one of your typical haunted spots.
Yeah. We have I live in the Nashville area in Tennessee, and we have a mall that has been there for a long time, but there's some stores that report a revolutionary soldier who, it's an intelligent haunting, and why he's in the Dillards at this mall and shows up and he knocks purses off, and many workers have seen him in the dressing rooms and stuff, which is interesting. You wouldn't think of, especially in Nashville, American Revolutionary type soldier, but yeah, it's interesting how the land can play into these places being haunted, even though we have modern buildings and businesses.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's why part of our job is to dig into the history of the property as well. But sometimes it's not the property; it could be the building, or it's not even the building itself. It could be a person that has some sort of attachment to them, or an object as well that has some sort of attachment to it. So you just never know until you really start digging into your case.
Yeah, and I preach on the show all the time about how it's very important to do your research and know the history of a location and the land, because it can help you understand why a place is haunted.
Yeah, exactly.
Another place that caught my attention in your first book was the haunted police station story, because you think of prisons and jails being haunted because, what goes on there, but an actual police station is kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's been a few haunted police stations. One was the 6th Precinct in Detroit. The gentleman had purchased the building and was going to turn it into kind of like a cloud server IT type business. And then he ended up doing a lot of restorations to it, and a lot of workers were reporting hearing footsteps. And I know a couple of workers like quit shortly afterwards, didn't want to work on the building. So he invited a paranormal investigation team in. They had actually seen shadow figures or an apparition. And one gentleman actually got locked into, I believe it was like the old evidence room, where they say a few police officers had killed themselves in. And he actually, luckily, he had a cell phone on him, so he had to call another team member to come and open the door. And I don't think the gentleman that purchased the building ever did turn it into like a cloud IT thing. I believe now he just kind of restored it, and it's almost a little bit of like a museum / paranormal tourism, because they allow groups to go in and investigate, and they also do haunted tours and things like that. So yeah, there's been a couple of police station stories that are haunted.
Have you collected any Bigfoot stories?
I collected 2 different stories on a Bigfoot type creature. In English, they call it the Bushman, but in Dene, which is the local indigenous people that live in Wati, the community up in the Northwest Territories, they call it Naga, and it's spelled Nagha, and means Bushman in English. They believe that this Bigfoot type creature is responsible for missing bush camp workers and children. And I had a friend work there before I got to Yellowknife, so it would have been prior to 2008. And he said he would get called out in the middle of the night, people swearing that the Bushman was creeping around the property. He'd go out and check, and there'd be no footprints on the property, and he would tell the homeowner that, and then they'd get mad at him and say, the Bushman doesn't leave footprints. And, and they seriously believe this. And he said another time during the day, there was like a town siren going off, and everybody was kind of running towards the community center. So he wasn't sure what was going on, so he stopped the vehicle and talked to a few people. And they said that somebody had spotted a Bushman on the outskirts of town. And so they were rounding everybody up in the community, especially all the kids, into the community center so that everybody would be safe. And then those were his 2 experiences with the Bushman. He didn't see it, but got called out to investigate it twice. And then another friend of mine had contacted me after my first law enforcement book came out, and it's in the second one that just came out. And he said that they had a call one night of what sounded like a girl screaming in the woods, and he didn't believe in and he still doesn't to this day believe in the Bigfoot or the Bushman. But the one thing that alarmed him was that one of the citizens swore that they heard not just a scream, but a female yell, "Help me." So that stuck in the back of his mind because, he was thinking it could be a fox mating. He actually did see a couple foxes that night. I think he saw a dead porcupine, so he attributed that the screams could have been made from the porcupine that got hit by a vehicle. But it was constantly nagging him the fact that one of the citizens had heard "Help me." So they spent hours investigating this case. They knocked on every single door in the house. This would have been a community, again, of 300 to 500 people. Knocked on all the doors, make sure everyone was accounted for. They checked the area where the screams were coming from. They even called the police dog service from Yellowknife, but because it was nighttime, they couldn't fly in at night. So they waited until the morning. They did fly in the police dog, and police dog checked everything out and couldn't find anything. No one was ever reported missing. They never did find any body or anything like that. But again, it just kind of goes to show you like how deeply entrenched that belief is in that community about that type of creature.
Yeah, here in the States, the indigenous populations, depending on what tribe you talk to, some of them lean more towards that the Bigfoot wild man is kind of a supernatural creature, and then you have other tribes that believe it's a very physical being and not anything supernatural.
Yes. Yeah, and you always hear different stories, like that one story from Waukee there. The local said that the Bushman doesn't leave footprints, so that would be like your supernatural type belief. Now, personally, do I think that such a creature could exist? I do think it's possible. If you go to Google and type in "new creature found" and hit news, you'll see that even in 2021, we're still discovering new species of fish in the ocean and bugs in the Amazon forest. And so we're discovering new life right here on Earth every day. So, I'm not going to come out and say there's absolutely no way that there's, this type of creature out there. There may very well be. There's been, for hundreds of years now, there's been multiple sightings and human experiences reporting this. So like the old saying says, where there's smoke, there's usually fire.
Yeah. And also, especially up in Canada, there's so much like expanses of forest and stuff where there's nobody for miles and miles around. And so a population, could survive, a small population, without really ever being captured or finding a body or anything like that.
Absolutely. Even when I was up north, when I took the boat course to take you out on Great Slave Lake, and you're thinking, Great Slave Lake, okay, like it's a lake or whatever. No, this lake is massive. It's one of the biggest lakes in, North America. And when you're out there in the middle of it, like it literally feels like you're in the middle of the ocean. Like it's got waves, it's got currents, like, it's huge. And there's other times too when I was doing training, I did a winter survival course. You're out in the middle of nowhere, like in the bushes, and it's just such like pristine land. Like there's no litter, there's no coffee cups laying around, McDonald's wrappers. Like this is like untouched, pristine land. So like you said, especially if it's like a small cohort that has learned to exist. And even look at, a simple animal like a fox. Like if you make a noise, that thing runs into the bushes. It knows to hide. It knows to, be quiet. It knows to be aware of its predator. So
right.
It's certainly fascinating. I definitely don't discount that there's some creatures out there that we haven't yet to identify.
Yeah, and with so many reports in North America, all around the world, not just North America, so many reports, there has to be something to it. It can't be all mistaken identity of bears and things like that.
No, I agree. Yeah.
So one of those stories that kind of caught my attention in the new book, and it's something that's always fascinated me, but I didn't really think to find it in a paranormal book. But you have a story about spontaneous human combustion.
Yeah, that was in my new one. Yeah, that was a really interesting case. So I dug that up from the FBI's files, and the lady's name was Mary Reeser. She was an elderly lady in Florida. And basically her landlord had run into a courier that was trying to deliver a letter to her. And the landlord said, "Oh yeah, I'll bring it up to Mary. I know where she's at." She goes upstairs, and right away she can tell something's wrong. There was heat coming from the apartment door, and she didn't like the feeling from it, so she called the police, and they came and investigated and found not much left of poor Mary. Her chair was completely incinerated. There was a foot left in a slipper. There was a couple of fragments which they thought were teeth, which later through forensic analysis determined that they were both real human teeth and one or two pieces of a denture. The apartment was in pretty good condition. The fire seemed to just kind of be concentrated around Mary and her chair. So, I had always heard of that case and, found it absolutely fascinating. It was interesting, though, to read the forensic report from the FBI because they said they get multiple cases like that every year, and they haven't yet found one that they couldn't explain or one that's caused by the supernatural. They basically say that the human body can act much like a candle wick, and that the fat kind of acts as a fuel. And so in these spontaneous human combustion cases, usually something has happened. So in this case, they found a piece of metal that they weren't sure whether it came from a lighter or it came from a hearing aid. But she was a smoker, and she had taken a drug to help her sleep. She had taken 2 pills while her son was visiting, and then before he left, she said she was going to take 2 more. So they think she passed out in her chair, and cigarettes may have lit her nightgown on fire. And then the reason why the fire had burned so intently near the chair was because of her body fat. And they actually, when the police went in to investigate, they found like a weird substance on the carpet, which was actually later determined to be human fat. So certainly a really fascinating case there. The other theory that I've heard tossed around about spontaneous human combustion is much like cancer, how cancer just develops within our body, and it's just cells that kind of go wrong and start attacking other cells. There's a spontaneous human combustion theory that something inside the body, a cell kind of explodes or ignites, and same kind of theory that heat causes the body to start burning from the inside, and then eventually the person engulfs in flames. So those are really fascinating cases. Obviously, I've never investigated one in 24 years that I've been doing this, but certainly they are really interesting cases.
Yeah. We were talking about unsolved mysteries earlier and kind of what got you into the paranormal, but I remember a story on unsolved mysteries of a gentleman who survived. And if I remember correctly, he was just in the kitchen with his wife, like washing dishes or something, and his shoulder started smoking. And he thought maybe his shirt caught on fire and he took his shirt off, but it was coming from his skin. And that story kind of stuck with me, and I found it interesting that, we have so many chemicals in our body, and we put chemicals in with food and, all this other stuff, that those chemicals maybe can, mix in a bad way, or you get too much of one or something and cause that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can tell that there's definitely some sort of biology at play in these cases for sure.
Yeah. And throughout the years of hearing stories and talking to people, one of the main kind of police stories that you hear in the paranormal are the kind of phantom calls, that calls coming from buildings where there's no phone line, or I've even heard a story. I was talking to one of the guests I was talking to a few weeks ago was telling me a story about a EMT who reported that they got a call, and they went to this call for a woman who had passed away. And when they went in, they passed this woman standing, and all she did was point. Well, when they got into the lady that was deceased, that was the lady who pointed them into the right direction down the hallway. And the only way that he could explain it was that it was her ghost. And there was nobody in the home to actually call 911 and call them to come to the house for a deceased person. So that's interesting. But those type of calls, those kind of phantom calls, are interesting to me.
Yeah, and as an EMT, you probably dealt with it as well. You would get what they call static 911 calls. We used to deal with it all the time, with the police. And one story in the new book came from an RCMP officer. So she was working one day. It wasn't rainy or windy, which is also a common reason for why we get static 911 calls. It must have something to do with the telephone line. because it always happens when it's storming really, really badly. You get these, static 911 calls. But this day was a clear day. She was working. She was fairly new. She received a static 911 call for a funeral parlor. So she attends, and she knocks on the door, and it was kind of funny. I remember telling me the story over the phone, and she said this guy that looked like Lurch from the Addams Family opened the door. She said he was extremely tall, very monotone, dressed typical funeral fashion. And she explained to him that, they received 911 call at the funeral parlor and that she's there to check it out. And he said that he didn't phone 911, but, she can come in. Now, in Canada, not sure about the States. I assume it would be the same. But in Canada, there's you don't need a warrant when somebody calls 911 to enter their house. There's just kind of common law that if somebody phones 911, the police have to enter the house to kind of clear it, because there's been cases where, the police got a 911 call, attended, only stood at the front door. Somebody told them everything was fine, when in fact there was a murder in progress inside. Right. So now, the common law is that if there's a 911 call, the police must go inside the house and clear it. A lot of people don't like that, because especially if they got illegal things going on in their house. But and that's usually how the police discover other illegal things, during that initial search. And what they do is they have to arrest the people in the house, back out, and get a warrant, go, say, do illegal grow-op or something like that. So in this case, she goes in and she goes to the buddy, shows her where the phone is. It's in the kitchen. She scrolls through it. Nobody dialed 911 on it. So she continues clearing the funeral parlor. As she's walking down the hallway, she said all of a sudden she felt like this ice-cold chill go through her. And she enters this room, and there was a body being prepared for burial in there. And she said it was interesting because it was right next to like a phone jack, but there was no phone attached to it. So she often wondered, was it one of those phone calls from the dead?
Right.
But it is interesting that it came from a funeral parlor, in that the body was next to a phone line, and that it was being prepared for burial, because normally after-death communication usually does occur within 24 to 72 hours. It's usually very shortly after. Yeah, so I thought that was a kind of a cool story. It wasn't just like I've been to lots of static 911 calls where there's actually nobody even home. It's just like people are away on vacation, or it's an abandoned home or whatnot. Right. But it was. I thought that one was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Those have always fascinated me. Just especially the ones where it's there's some kind of paranormal element to it, like you were saying. Some of the other stories you got in the new book too, that I talk about a lot here on the show, because I hate that the TV shows now make the demonic possession stuff so prevalent, and there's a couple of hosts that get possessed every show. But you got a few possession cases in the new book.
In this one I did, yeah. It was kind of interesting. So one's kind of a third hand story, but it was kind of neat. It was from a friend of mine that had met up later with his priest that he grew up with. He was involved in the church as a young fella, and a few people that were involved in the church all got together one day with this priest, and somehow the topic of demons had come up. And one girl that was at the table said she didn't believe in that kind of stuff. And then the father just spontaneously started telling about his experience in Peru. And he said when he was a young, new priest, he went and did a Catholic mission over in Peru. And he said he was at home one night, and there was a bang on his door, and it was a family that were coming to him for assistance, saying that their daughter was possessed. He ended up going over to the house and saw that the girl was in bed. She was not looking well. She was kind of contorted, extremely contorted, almost kind of seizuring. He was not an exorcist, but as he said to my friend, he would do what any person of faith would do in that situation and start praying. So he went through a bunch of prayers and kind of a ritual, and was able to kind of restore peace to the house. And the thing about possession is that there's a lot of things in mental illness that can mirror possession.
Right.
Really got this hammered home when I took Karen O'Keefe's course there recently. So what parapsychologists look for in these types of cases are things that are outside of what mental illness would be. So one thing would be levitation. If somebody's reporting the bed levitated or a person levitated, well, that's outside of the mental illness realm. Also, people that have hidden knowledge or knowledge they shouldn't have. So, for example, if I told you that, you know, your mother's name is Mary and you grew up on 123 Main Street in Santa Monica, California, and I knew all these details about you, and I have no idea, you know, where you grew up or who your mother was, or there's nothing on the internet about you or anything like that, that's another sign.
Right.
And then also foretelling future events as well. Could be something as simple as, you know, you're going to go downtown tomorrow night and you're going to witness somebody almost get hit by a bus, and then sure enough, that happens. There's been like little tiny things like that demonic entities have given people to kind of gain their trust, because it always starts out as kind of a benevolent spirit, just kind of friendly, you know, trying to make communication with you, rapping, maybe answering you on the Ouija board. And so there's been cases where they'll give them little menial future information to kind of build trust with them, so that it eventually leads to the next stage after infestation, which is the oppression stage. So, yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, obviously there's a lot of things in mental illness that do mimic possession, like seizures, for example. But when we talk about contortion, like the priest was talking in this case, we're talking about like extreme contortion. Like we're talking about, it almost looks like the facial bones and structure of the face are actually changing, like almost like bones are shifting in the face. So it's like extreme. And another one is obviously speaking languages that the person should have no knowledge of. You know, if they start speaking Latin, for example, and they've never taken a Latin course or anything like that, you know, that's another kind of parapsychological symptom that we would look for.
And the inevitable question, of course, is in your years as a parapsychologist, have you ever come across any true demonic possession? I'm
on the fence on this one, because the first book that I wrote, Evil in Exeter, if it wasn't a demonic entity, then it was a very hateful spirit. So what happened basically in the I'll see if I can sum this up. So the homeowner in Exeter was basically a medium that didn't know how to use her skill sets. That's what three different mediums had told other people she knows. She's never been to see a psychic or a medium, but her sister has been to see a couple. And these three mediums have always passed along a message. They said, I have a message passed along to your sister. Tell her that I can sense that, you know, she has this ability and spirits are attracted to her. And they think that she can help them, and she's like a beacon of light is the way that they describe it. So for her entire life, as long as she can remember, she's always had spirits around her. When she was a teenager, she was dating an abusive male, and they had just gotten back from a fair, and he was going to pull her hair and pop one of the balloons in the kitchen, and she had this look on her face like there was somebody standing behind them. So when he turned around, they both saw this 6-foot-tall entity with no eyes. It just had black eye sockets, like pale moon gray skin, and he just kind of stared there at the two of them, and then it disappeared, and the abusive boyfriend ran into the house and never came back. So one of the mediums that her sister had seen was Arabic, and this will make sense a little bit on here in the story, and he said that she had some sort of jinn attached to her. Now, in the Quran, a jinn can be either an angel or a demon, good or bad, equivalent. And the other two mediums said that there was something attached to her they felt was male and not very nice. So then when I met her in 2018, she had kind of warned me that she has paranormal activity happen around her all the time. I was still active police officer at the time, and obviously, you know, involved in the paranormal, so I wasn't too worried or concerned. Ended up meeting her in person. One weekend, I rented a hotel, and she kind of took me around and showed me all the different cool spots in New England. It was awesome. I got to see like the real Conjuring house, the Sneaker house, which is based on the film Haunting in Connecticut, Mercy Brown's grave, which is a girl that's always accused of being a vampire. And the devil's footprints in North Kingston. There's a story that the devil left his footprints there. We actually found this in the rock. It was really hard to find, but luckily somebody gave the GPS coordinates on the internet, so we were able to find it. So it was really cool. So the next time I went down, I stayed at her house, but she gave me fair warning that, stuff usually happens. And sure enough, I was there, and it started out with the kids not sleeping for 4 days. Every time they try and go to sleep, they would be woken up by something. They said they could hear scratching on their wall. Of course, being a police officer, I went outside. I looked up at the window, make sure there's no tree branches scraping against it, no animals up there. I'd stay in the room for a little bit. They couldn't hear anything in the walls, so it wasn't like a mouse or rat inside the walls. Then other things started to happen. I heard 3 distinct footsteps approach me one time and then just stop when it was like 2 feet away from me. I was in the little boy's room doing a house blessing, and I saw the doorknob turn 3/4 of the way, and I opened it up, and there's nobody on the other end. And towards the end of the investigation is where I'm not 100% sure, like I said, whether it was just a nasty spirit or if it was something demonic. But the kids weren't home one time, and it was just me and the homeowner. And I was using some religious provocation, because at this time we kind of sensed that this thing might be evil. And I was asking, in the name of Jesus Christ, to give me a sign if there's anything present, and that I commanded to give me a sign, and nothing happened. And I was doing this for maybe a good half hour. But the next day, her son started to display all kinds of strange behavior. He was hissing like a snake. He was like kind of squirmy and moving around like a snake. He hated everybody. She had a couple of blessed medallions from the church, and she had some regular ones. I mean, whenever she would put the blessed medallions on, and he knew which ones were blessed, and he would throw them across the floor and say, "This is from the church." And this is like a 4-year-old child that is not practicing Christian, which is one parapsychological flag when people have aversion to a religious object.
Yeah.
I actually put the sign of the cross with holy water on his forehead, and his nose started to bleed, just like something you'd see out of the movies. The following day, we dropped him off at school, and we went home, and then it was time to pick him up. So we went and got him, and the homeowner asked me, she said, "How do you think he's going to act today?" And I said, it's like probably the same that it's been like the last 2 days. Like, I don't think we're going to pick him up and everything's just going to be all right. So sure enough, we pick him up. The school had mentioned that he's acting strange. He didn't want to wash himself, like he was dirty, and didn't want to wash his hands, which was not unlike him, or like him, I should say. On the way home, again, he was like hissing in the back of the car. He was trying to hit us, trying to bite us. We picked his sister up at the bus stop. We no sooner pull into the driveway, and her music had been playing through her iPhone onto her vehicle. And all of a sudden, her music cuts out, and you can hear her voice talking. And it took me a second to realize that it was me, it was my voice. And what had happened is somehow it had connected. So her vehicle had somehow connected to my phone through Bluetooth. It had somehow opened up my voice notes. It had somehow found the recordings. I had multiple recordings on my phone from the day before. And it had actually started right at the point where, because we just pulled up to the house and put the car in park, and it just started at the part where I said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, give me a sign of your presence." And that came over the radio, like loud, like it was like on full blast, 30 or whatever the max volume was.
Wow.
So once that happened, then we tried to contact the family priest, who's been in a few different paranormal shows. His name's Father Bob Bailey. Does deliverance type work. So unfortunately, he had been reassigned to hospital work, and he wasn't able to assist. So we had to do the next best thing, which was we went to a medium that we knew and relied upon. And she was non-denominational, so she came over one night. The kids weren't there. She had sage and herbs, put it in a pie plate, lit it on fire, did her non-denominational prayers. We eventually go upstairs to the master bedroom where a lot of the activity would occur. And I had the FLIR at that time because after the doorknob incident in the kids' bedroom, I purchased a FLIR for PPRI. And me and the homeowner could feel this ice cold spot appear in between us. And I checked it on the floor, and there was nothing, which is actually not uncommon. A lot of people report the sensation of a cold spot or a hot spot, but it actually doesn't show up on the equipment. So we told the medium that part, and she started to kind of summon the entity over towards her. And then the next thing we know, me and the homeowner see on the floor, all of a sudden these dark, distorted, almost like hoof prints appeared to form right across the bed cover. And the pie plate was in the middle of the bed, and it was piping hot. You could see that on the floor. But then there was like these dark, distorted hoof prints that appeared across the bed, walked around the sage and herbs that were burning, and over towards the medium. We didn't tell her that we were seeing all this at this point in time. And then she kind of just blurts out and says, I feel like, I sense like the entity is over by me. And I was looking at the floor thinking like, yeah, no kidding. And I do remember she said the Michael the Archangel prayer, and she said a couple other prayers. And then all of a sudden, she felt that the energy had dissipated. And shortly after that, those distorted footprints, which I have pictures of before and after in the book, they disappeared off the bed cover. And but I looked at the homeowner, and she looked at me, and we looked at the medium, and we said, well, we don't feel any different. And she said, well, it's not like the movie, like the windows aren't going to blow out and papers aren't going to fly in the air and the roof's not going to rip off. She said, you know, basically all I can tell you is I feel like that the energy's gone. And, you know, that was, that would have been, I think, November of 2018. And knock on wood, the family has not really reported anything further since then. So was it dynamic? I mean, there were certainly a few indicators there for sure, especially with the behavior of the little boy. And some things did happen in threes. There were certainly a few indicators. The one thing, I guess, that really has me on the fence about whether or not it's dynamic was an incident that happened before we expelled the entity. And what had happened is, so in Rhode Island anyway, kids that go to pre-kindergarten either go in the morning or the afternoon. So her young fella went in the afternoon, and the daughter was in school full time. So in the morning, it's just usually the homeowner and her son until noon when she has to drop him off to pre-kindergarten. So they were home down in the basement, checking the cat litter and cat's water and food. When she came upstairs, her iPhone was face up, and the screen was lit up. So she thought either I had texted her or her mother texted her. So when she looked at the phone, something had spoken into the phone, and it said, "Hey, Suri, Malik, dirty girl." And in the response, it said, "In my realm, you can be anything."
Wow. And
she took a screenshot of it, and she called me. And so I said, okay. I was like, let me do some research and, you know, like, let's figure this out. So we checked it with three other iPhones. Sorry, there was one in the States on the same network, AT&T, and then two in Canada. And every time you manually spoke into the phone and said that term, the proper response should have been, I just don't understand this gender thing. That's what the iOS software was programmed to respond. So then I looked up Malik, the name Malik, and found out that Malik is actually a jinn in the Quran that is in charge of multiple other demons in hell. And it's Malik's job to kind of crank the heat up and torture souls. So after we find out all this, and this was said over the phone, not in front of the little boy, a couple hours later, the little boy brings his mother a picture. And it's like a stick figure with all these blue swirls around. So she's like, "Oh, what's this?" And the little boy said, "Well, that's the little boy that likes to play in my toy room in the fire. And he wants me to come join him in the fire." And she's like, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, there's a little boy that likes to play in my toy room, and he plays in fire. And he told me that I should come play with him in the fire." And so she's like, "No, like, you know, kids don't play with fire and this and that." And then, you know, texts me, and now she's really getting freaked out because first there was the phone, then there was the picture. Now the third thing is kind of less powerful, I guess, but they always kept the statue of the Virgin Mary in the kids' room, and it was up on top of the armoire. And in the entire time that I would visit the house, I've never seen this item fall or get knocked over. And I would even see the kids climb up the armoire to like turn the volume up on the TV if they couldn't find the remote, or turn the TV off. And I've never seen this statue fall. But on this particular day, when it was time to bring him to school, she went up to get a change of clothes, and the statue of the Virgin Mary was face down on the floor. Now, again, the kids, sure, they could have bumped the armoire or whatever, and that would have fell down.
Right.
But the term that was spoken into the iPhone, Apple didn't have like an explanation on why the response was different, because at the time, the iOS software should have said, I just don't understand this gender thing. And then the fact that the little boy is describing this entity that's playing in his toy room in fire, which is exactly what this Malik demon does. That's kind of where I'm right on the fence of, was this actually demonic, or, was this just a really nasty person? Because in parapsychology, we believe that when consciousness moves on into that next world, that everything stays the same. So if you were a kind, gentle person in real life, that's going to carry over. That energy, that personality is going to carry over. If you were a mean jerk in real life, you're probably going to be the same mean jerk, in the afterlife. That's why some cases that get reported to you, it goes for mischievous, or, if it's your grandparents kicking around, you smell that baking bread that they always used to make, or that cigar that grandpa used to smoke, because it's the same type of consciousness that's carrying on. So that's the closest I ever came to one. Certainly I would help anyone that, was claiming that they have, an evil or demonic entity, but they're not as cool cases. It might be cool as a listener, but when you're actually involved in the investigation and you can see, these things manipulate, toys and electronics and physical things in our world, it's not so cool. You know what I mean? Because there's a lot we don't understand, and it's hard to protect yourself against something that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, and I think that's what scares a lot of people, a lot of homeowners who aren't into the paranormal and experience paranormal stuff. And then with the stuff on TV that they see, they kind of go straight to everything's evil. But I've said many times on the show, kind of one of my mottos on the show, if you're an asshole in life, you're probably going to be an asshole in death.
Exactly. That's one quote I usually say. I just try not to swear on the podcast in case you guys have to edit it out, but that's exactly what I say. Yeah. You're bang on there.
Yeah, I've said it so many times on the show here, and they probably get tired of me saying it. But I'm just trying to drive the point home that, these TV shows are entertainment, and it's not everything is demonic or evil. And just because you get pushed or scratched doesn't mean that the spirit is a demon or, that type of stuff. It might just be their only way to get your attention.
Exactly. There's actually another story in my new book where the police officer was getting static 911 calls to this abandoned house. And at the end of the story, he ends up finding out that there's two spirits attached to the house. One is like this kind of farmer guy that just wants to be left alone. But then there's this other entity in the basement that is the one responsible for making the static 911 calls. He loves like the attention, and he loves like playing jokes and like kind of like like getting people, like getting the police to respond kind of thing. Like he somehow gets like a kick out of it or whatnot. And all this came from a medium that the police officer had met on Reddit. And she was very accurate. He didn't tell her what community he was in or where the location was, but she knew details about the house, like inside the house.
Yeah.
And also around the house. So, for example, she talked about a corner store that was nearby the house, and sure enough, there was like a corner store nearby the house. Like, she gave such specific details that the police officer believed, that she had that mediumistic ability.
Right.
And that's a case where it's not necessarily a demon; it's just a guy that maybe he was mischievous in real life,
Right.
And for whatever reason, he still gets a kick at playing pranks and jokes in the afterlife.
Yeah. So all the stories that you have told today, including the possible demonic, they can find that full story with, I'm sure, loads of more details and evidence and that type of stuff in your book, Evil in Exeter, and all of the police stories they can find in both of your Supernatural Encounters books. And those are available on Amazon, Kindle, or at your website, ppri.net. And they can also find you on Facebook.
Yeah, and ppri.net, I always tell everyone, is the best place to go. It's got, like I said, there's a little store section that'll bring you to all the different links that sell not only my books, but my colleague Darryl Walsh's books. It's got a resource section, which lists out all the credible educational spot that if anyone's interested in taking parapsychology courses, they can go check that out. There's also a new section I just created called Parapsychological Studies. And I started to upload a few different studies that have been done. For example, the Pierce Prass study, which was done by J.B. Ryan from Duke University way back when, which shows that distance does not affect extrasensory perception. So when people call a reputable medium and say they live in Florida and I'm in Nova Scotia, well, that study shows that distance shouldn't affect extrasensory perception. So if the person is a legit medium that has that ability, then by talking to you over the phone and giving you insight over the phone, it shouldn't actually, make it weaker.
Right.
So I think it's important to see where these kind of studies go from, because I think a lot of people probably base their information on the paranormal off what's on TV. And I know from personal experience that what you see on TV is not real life. There's a lot of fallacies that those shows promote. So our website has a lot of good resources on there, and it's got our contact information. It's got links to my social media accounts. It's got our team information, our organization information. It's just a wealth of knowledge. Yeah,
and like you said, y'all serve the Atlantic coast of Canada as well as the New England area of the United States.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
All right. Well, I thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed talking to you.
No problem. Thanks for reaching out and have me on. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. All right, everybody, go check out all of Dr. Van Dusen's books and links. And I appreciate y'all listening. Y'all have a good day. And as always, stay safe out there. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening. To the end of the line. Whoa. I can feel you as you pass the other side, as if I even